All right, guys, I guess it's 10:02, our customary start time, so I will dive right in here. Here we are, lecture 4, right? Today it's an exciting day. We get to talk a little bit about market equilibrium once we put some other pieces into place. Before that, I will just alert you to the fact that the Top Hat readings are multiplying fairly quickly here, so we're up to chapter 6. Most of the chapters are pretty short, but they're starting to get a little bit more in depth, and they'll require a little bit more sort of patience with you as you read them, right? One thing it's very hard to do with economics is to kind of read everything at once, right? You're better off doing a little bit here and a little bit there and letting it sink in. So I gently encourage you to start with the readings and get into all of that. So we talked a little bit about exams last time, and I'm finalizing this date now. Monday, September 30th, right? About a month into the semester, we'll have our first exam. There's always a lot of questions about the exam. We'll have a whole sort of exam thing going on, and we'll start it up a week before the exam, right? So that is a Monday. The Monday prior to that, I'll distribute a practice exam. Right, and then Thursday, you'll have a chance to do it and maybe get some grading and some feedback. And then Thursday, we'll devote entirely to reviewing the exam. I make the 2 exams in parallel. So the idea is to remove any uncertainty that you might have about what the exam will look like, how long it will be, content, so on, and all that stuff, right? Because that's usually, in my experience, especially with students, I know a lot of, after my poll especially, I know a lot of you are first-year students, there's a lot of uncertainty just about mechanics, right? What do the questions look like? Are they multiple choice? Do I need to do any computations? And those aren't really anything, none of that has to do with economics. So what I'm trying to do is let you focus on the economics and remove all the uncertainty, from everything else. It's like, when you go on a job interview, you want to worry about the job and all of that stuff. You don't want to worry about how you're going to get there and what you're going to wear. I'm trying to take all that out of the bargain, right? The practicalities of it. So it seems like I have a hard time believing this is I guess we're okay. Look at the camera. Okay. So note that there's people have had top hat problems and all of that stuff. I've been trying to iron out all of that as we go along. This is kind of bothering me. It just looks like it's in the way. I've been trying to kind of iron out all the difficulties with that stuff as we go along. One thing is I saw a couple of people during office hours this week, people asking questions about the homework, right? There's 3 problem sets up, 2 more probably before the exam, just while I'm on the subject. If you have something that you don't get in Top Hat, right, in a homework problem, you can fire me an email and say, hey, let me, I don't quite get this problem. Could you go over it for me, explain it to me? That actually gives me something to do to kind of get us into class, right? So I can do that, if you have a couple of questions you'd like to see done, we can do them collectively. My experience is that if one student shows up at office hours asking me about something, there's usually 30 other students at least that have a similar question. So there's that. One other thing that is kind of, I guess I should say, is after I did my first attendance exercise, I received a whole bunch of emails. I guess word got around that I had done, maybe I'm preaching to the choir here, because obviously I'm starting to get familiar faces in class. I got a bunch of emails from students saying, well, I couldn't make class because of this, that, or the other thing, and all of that. I had an appointment, so on and so forth. This is your appointment, right? Coming to class here is your appointment. So do the best that you possibly can to not schedule other things during class, right? Think about it this way. When you come to, I know a lot of you are commuting to school, you're coming from home and all of that. A lot of you have pressures at home and all of that. Do your best to make this your time to do your subject, right? It's very easy to give it up and say, well, I don't have to go to class, blah, 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 this and that and the other thing. Consider this as something, and that's one reason why I'm sort of big on attendance, right? Is that I think you need to get used to protecting your time to do specific subjects and to concentrate on this. Yeah, it's funny. One reason why I record the lectures is not for you guys, because it kind of focuses me. Even if I never watch them, it makes me think twice about what I'm going to say and being organized and making sure it all makes sense. It kind of focuses me, right, in a weird way. So this is our time, and just kind of think about it that way. One reason why I do attendance. So speaking of attendance, I have to do verification of attendance. And that means I just have to confirm that you've shown up at class at some point. What I typically do is I look at the Top Hat roster, and I just see if you're on there, and then that's my verification of attendance exercise. So that's kind of what I'm going to do. If for some reason you're not on there, or you haven't put your name, even if you put in your name and you haven't paid yet, it should be fine. If you haven't, please let me know. Send me an email, fill me in as to why you're not appearing there yet. Okay, I've gotten some good comments on the videos. Keep them coming. And as I think I already said, we're going to have a couple more homeworks before the exam, which is still a bit of a ways off. What is it, the 12th today? But it comes up faster than you might think, right? So, okay. That was kind of the usual preamble stuff. I'm going to dive right into the lecture here. Last time it was exciting. We got to start to talk about markets a little bit, right? Big subject in economics. And our divide and conquer strategy for understanding markets was to first break out the demand part of the whole thing and think about demand, right? And what that looks like, right? And this is we saw that, I guess at its barest essence, a demand is just a demand schedule, right? You have quantities and you have prices, and the demand curves for a typical consumer, you sort of fix conditions, and then you ask this consumer, how much would you be willing to buy at all these various prices, right? And then you can plot the amount out. The operable concept there, do I have it here? Was the law of demand, right? Was that everything else equal, as price goes up, quantity demanded should go down, right? Or as price goes down, quantity demanded should go up. And of course, we talked about all those things that we had to hold constant behind the scenes here, right? We need to, it's one of these things where if you're asking someone if they're going to buy something, and you're thinking about them as having some sort of, value in their heads, right? You need to hold that thing constant while you're changing the price, right, to get a consistent answer to these questions. So, income, weather, tastes, those were, I guess I could fold that into tastes. The price of other goods, complements, substitutes, we talked about all of these things. The good news is we can also include those in our demand model as shifters of demand, and this is actually an interesting exercise we're going to engage in a little bit, is we'll practice shifting around demand and supply a little bit. Maybe your first kind of encounter with practicing economics will be shifting curves around to try to explain what's going on in the world. We'll do a little of that today. We haven't said much about the steepness or flatness of the curve, but we're going to delve into that a little bit today as well. And the last thing is we have this, maybe a semantic approach to thinking or discussing demand. When we talk about changes in demand, we're usually referring to shifting the curve, right? Changes in the demand schedule itself. Quantity demanded is a particular point along the curve, right? And so that's, a semantic thing that we'll try to keep straight as we move along, so we can all agree what we're talking about. Okay, just to refresh your memory, we saw that, as you ask people, we had two consumers here, Tina and Tim, and their demand for water. You can see here we have plots of their demand curves and their demand schedules up there, right? And it's just, how much water would you buy at each given price? Plot out the results. If we want, we can add those up and get a market demand, right? It's really that simple. Of course, there were two things I pointed out about all of this, right? One of which was that I'm talking about, we're putting a price in front of you and saying how much would you buy, and then we plot it though with the amount you buy and price on the vertical axis, right? So it's almost a little backwards from the typical way you think about these things, right? If you think about price as the independent variable and quantity demanded as the dependent one. just a note of caution, and maybe I'll just put a pin there so in the future when we come back to it, you'll see why we've done this. Okay. There's one other thing about this that I think I'm going to touch on in another slide. I'm trying to get better about not talking ahead of my slides, so I'm saving that for a second here. Quick review of demand. Supply is going to be kind of the other side of the coin, right? So instead of asking, say, a consumer, how much would you buy at particular prices, we ask a firm, a business, right, a supplier of something, I guess, the same questions. If the price was this, how much of that product would you bring to market? If the price was instead this, how much of that product would you bring to market, right? We give a firm, we'll say just a business, give a business some prices, and out the other side will come the quantities that this firm would supply, right? We expect that the curve is upward sloping. That is to say, at higher prices, firms should supply more of the product. Oftentimes in this class, students raise their hand at this point in time and they say, well, wait a minute. What about situations in which, the firm, you give it a higher price and the firm decides to sell less and all that stuff? Well, we're going to save that for later in the semester. Suffice it to say now that don't think about things that way, because you're kind of confounding the pricing decision that a firm might make with its supply decision. Right now, it's just, if this were the price, how many of the units of the product would you supply? Now, we have to also, I'm going a little fast here, assuming that you maybe are seeing how the mechanics behind this will work. We have to hold things constant in the background for the same reasons we did for demand, right? Like, let's suppose I were to ask a firm, one day I asked the firm, at a price of $2, how much bottled water would you supply? The firm says 1,000 units. The next day I say, okay, or the next month maybe, I say, how about a price of $3? Firm says, okay, 3,000 units, right? And then I say, well, let's try a lower price, maybe a couple months down the road. I say, how much would you supply at $1? And the firm says 10,000 units. And I say, well, wait a minute, 1,000, 3,000, 10,000 at a lower price? What happened? And the firm might say, well, in the interim, we discovered a new way of pumping bottled water out of the ground, and it makes it much cheaper. And I'd say, well, wait a minute. Now you're answering kind of a different question, right? Something else has changed in the background, put another way. So this is my rough way of saying you have to fix all of that stuff in the background and then get consistent answers to the questions. For exactly the same reason we had to fix the stuff in the background for demand, right? Changing price, everything else constant. So the big ones, the big things that we're holding constant in the background are technology. That was kind of my example, right? The firm isn't making new discoveries as it's answering our questions. And the other one, the big one, or another big one, is the price of things that the firm is using to produce. That is to say, the price it's paying its workers, the price it's paying for its machinery, electricity, so on and so forth. So that's a lot, right? That's a big deal. Question?
Yeah, I just want to make sure on something. So basically, the more something is in demand, the higher the prices, because they want to maximize profits.
Geez. Okay, so I'm glad you asked that question, but I'm going to say leave that stuff out of it for now, right? That's about profit maximization and choosing price and quantity and all of that stuff. We're getting there, right? So think about it this way. We have a divide and conquer strategy going here. We're saying if we just take demand and price, it's here. We're just taking supply and price here. We haven't yet talked about what a firm will decide to do, right? Or how it goes about maximizing profits in greater detail than that. Yes?
Yeah, and I also wanted to say, does lower prices mean less demand, so the products can sell more?
Does lower prices mean less demand? You would typically say lower prices means greater demand, right? Right? That's the law of demand. At lower prices, people buy more. At higher prices, they buy less. But once again, the statement, remember, ceteris paribus, everything else. And I think what you're trying to do is bring other things into the problem and change them. But go again.
The graphs say, because according to the graphs in the slide, it states that the demand decreases as the prices.
I would say that differently. I would say that the demand is constant here. The quantity demanded is going down as the price, or the quantity demanded is going up as the price decreases, right? That's kind of how I would say it, and I'll let you even think about that a little bit, right? Why I would say it that way. The quantity demanded, right? The point along the curve, we slide this way as the price goes down, right? Quantity up, price down. Okay, so hopefully you'll start to see how this works. And once again, one great thing about this question is we're getting a lot of practice just, trying to restrain ourselves and think about only what we have here in front of us. I know you're really itching to add in more details and more complexities. But it's also, thinking about a graph and how it works is a little trickier than the first impression might suggest. Okay, supply, shifters, and all of that stuff. Okay, well, here we have an example, right, where we take supply. We have two fictional firms here, Agua and Prima, right, water suppliers, bottled water market, I guess. And we've asked these firms how many thousands of bottles per day would they supply at different prices, right? So we say if the price of bottled water was $1 Agua, what are you supplying? 1,000 units. The price of water was $1. How about you, Prima? We'll supply 2,000. Why do you think that is? Why is Prima supplying more water than Agua? Well, you might guess that Prima, is maybe situated closer to a lake. Maybe it has different technology in place. Firms are different, and so maybe Prima just has a different set of circumstances that allow it to produce more water. But at any rate, as we kind of move our prices up and down, we get these different quantities, right? And of course, we can just add up the quantities that each firm produces to get the market supply, right? And once again, you look at this and you say that's really all we're saying is when we put these prices in front of firms, this is what they do. Of course, almost really everything I said about demand applies here as well, right? That we have the price on the vertical axis, even though that's kind of the variable that I'm feeding the firm, right? The independent variable, as you might understand things after high school algebra. And then the quantity on the horizontal axis. Same exact stuff. And there's one thing I'm dying to say, but I'm trying to resist saying it because, okay, good, I have a slide for this. The other thing I was going to mention beyond the emphasizing price on the vertical axis, quantity on the horizontal axis, is both demand and supply encode information, right? In the case of demand, it encodes information about how valuable each unit is, right? Going back to what I said this before last time, right? What we can infer here, if we just look at Tina, right? When we start with a price of $2, she buys 0 water. When the price goes to $1.50, she buys 1 unit. Well, this implies that her valuation is somewhere between $2 and $1.50 for that first bottle, right? Well, when the price falls to $1, she buys a second bottle, right? Now what we have here is if we look at the whole curve up to this point, well, the first bottle we can still say was between $2 and $1.50. The second bottle, right, we can say is somewhere between $1.50 and $1. So in some sense, this curve traces out Tina's valuation, right? The same with Tim, and the same with the market. Right? Even if we just have this curve and we look at what happens when the price goes from $1.50 to $1, we see that consumption, or I should say the amount that consumers want, goes from 1 to 3. Well, that means that 2 people out there, or I guess 2 bottles of water, are valued by consumers somewhere between $1.50 and $1. And once again, our curve is tracing out valuations. Okay, that's going to become important in a while. We might revisit that, or we will revisit that in a while. But I would also like to suggest that the same thing is true here on the supply curve. right? And this might go to the comment earlier we had about profit maximization. I'm shying away right now from saying more about it because we're going to say a lot more about it shortly. But suffice it to say that we can think about this supply curve as actually encoding not value but cost information, right? Think about it this way. When I put a price of 50 cents to Agua, right, and I say, how many bottles of water would you supply to the market at 50 cents? Agua says 0. And I say, well, why 0? Agua says, well, it costs us more to produce a bottle of water than the price at that point. So let's see, if price is less than cost, I'm losing money whenever I make it, right? So it doesn't make sense for me to produce anything until the price goes above the cost, right? Rationality, right? The firm is behaving rationally, and that's kind of, we'll see that it's a little bit different than profit maximization, but that's really the core concept here. So to kind of flesh out that logic, as we offer Agua $1 instead of 50 cents, Agua says, oh, okay, now we'll produce 1,000 bottles a day. And I say, oh, 1,000 bottles. What inference can we make if our firm is behaving rationally? Well, it costs the firm less than $1 per unit to produce those units, right? Something more than 50, but less than 1,000, right? To produce that first 1,000 units. So once again, that is kind of traced out here by this curve, that idea. So you can imagine if we varied it continuously, if we said 51, 52, 53, we might get an answer about how costly it is to produce each unit. So one thing that then suggests is that the supply curve is sloping upwards because the costs of doing more and more and more of something are increasing, right? So, for example, Agua then goes to 2,000 units at a price of $1.50. We would say, oh, that's interesting. It cost Agua somewhere between 50 cents and $1 to produce a unit before, but now it's somewhere between $1 and $1.50. The costs of this next 1,000 units, put another way, have gone up, right? And you can think about that as a manifestation of this principle of increasing costs. Right? The first units that Agua supplies to the market are the ones that are the easiest to produce. If it has to produce more than that, given its resources, well, what does it have to do? Well, you might think about it this way, and if we're talking about water, maybe if you're going to pump more water out of the ground and bottle it, it gets a little bit harder because you have to go a little bit deeper, right, to get the water. So it comes from a further distance. Maybe that's a better way to think about it. There's a pond here, a pond there, and you don't bring pond number 2, which is further away, into production until, right, the price gets to be high enough and it's worth it. So that's why production goes up here. By the way, I like that explanation because it'll dovetail very nicely with some of the discussion we'll have, maybe even today, about oil prices, if not today, in the future. Now, the other thing I said about this was, even though in a market, when we add up all the firms together, that doesn't mean that inference goes away, right? We can still say when the price goes to $1 to $1.50, and supply goes from 3 to 5,000 per day, that this 2,000 units here, well, the costs of that were somewhere above $1. Why? Because nobody found it in their interest to supply those before, and something less than $1.50 because now they do, right? Maybe I'm harping on that a little bit, but this is something I think, a lot of students coming out of high school or who have had some prior experience with economics can draw a supply and demand curve. It's an X, right? But understanding what the information that lies underneath is quite important. In fact, we're going to do some of that later in class today. Maybe I'm going fast, but I'm going to do it anyway. I'm going to dive right in and say, now we're in a position to talk about market equilibrium. We'll put it all together, buyers and sellers, suppliers and demanders, and we'll see what happens, right, when we put them together. And we'll think about this market equilibrium as occurring where buyers and sellers' plans are consistent. So in a very superficial way, you can think about it this way. An equilibrium is a point that occurs where somewhat conflicting interests, right, are balanced. So people like to pay low prices, right? They buy more at low prices. That's the law of demand. I guess I could call it the law of supply, is that suppliers like higher prices, right? So obviously a supplier would love to sell a lot at a low price, a lot at a high price. A consumer would like to buy a lot at a low price. Equilibrium is kind of where their interests are balanced. And indeed, we think about it as an equilibrium because at this particular point, there really isn't any incentive for the market to change or to adopt what it's doing. The other thing I'll say about it, I'll reserve this. I'll draw it up there in a second, and you can see how it looks. Okay, so here we have quantity and price. I'll draw my demand function in, right? I'll draw my supply function in, right? One of the things, by the way, that we did was we constructed these so that the units here and here were the same. So as a result, you can kind of graph them all in the same space, right? And of course, at this point, the two cross, and we'll call this, I guess I can call this Q star and P star. We think of these as the equilibrium price and quantity here, right? Now I've kind of just thrown this up here and drawn two curves and told you that where they cross, it's important. So now I can suggest why we in fact call it an equilibrium. Well, equilibrium is kind of a term you may have encountered in many other things you've studied at some point, like maybe chemistry or, physics, biology, maybe, I don't know. And usually what it suggests is that this is a point of stability, right? An equilibrium is something where a system comes to rest. And indeed, economics often aspires to be like physics, for better or for worse. I have lots of thoughts about that subject, and I get into it in my history of thought class quite a bit. But if you look at the diagram as it's positioned, you can kind of see why. I'll show you in a second. You can see why you would think this point of equilibrium is a place where the market would come to rest, right? So let's suppose that my bottled water market, I don't have any exact numbers, but let's suppose it comes to rest at a point where the price is $2 and the quantity is 5,000 bottles per day. We might ask what would happen if the price somehow, for some reason, was higher than this in the market, right? Maybe in our stylized world, we have everybody showing up at the bottled water exchange place, and we observe that the price, on the big screen up there that we're all supposed to buy and sell at, is now something like $2.25, right? Maybe this surprises us if we're consumers. We say, $2.25. I was going to buy X, right, of this product when it was $2, but now it's higher. Price is a little bit higher. I don't want as much, right? I don't want to pay $2.25. Meanwhile, suppliers say, $2.25, that's great. It's higher than we thought it would be. We'll bring a little bit more to market, right? But when the two parties show up, suppliers with this amount and demanders wanting this amount, suppliers wanting to sell this amount, demanders wanting to buy this amount, you can see here, right, that quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded at this price, right? Well, we would call that a surplus. At the going price, people want more of the product. People want to sell more. I should say firms want to sell more of the product than people want to buy. Well, what is the natural thing to have happen in this case? Well, $2.25, it's too high, Maybe someone says, over here, I'll pay $2.20 for water. And so some firms go over there, right, and sell. And as time goes on, you would expect that this would create downward pressure on the price, right? Firms have an excess amount to sell. So people don't want to buy it. Lower the price and people will. And so a combination of more buying and less selling from this point will push us back towards this point here, right? The same would be true if we started below. And that wasn't the greatest story in the world, but hopefully you get the idea. If we started below, the same would be true as well, also, right? So here, at this low price, firms have only shown up with this amount of the product. Consumers, meanwhile, want this amount. People are very willing to buy the product, right? at a low price, but firms aren't willing to sell it. We would call this a shortage. Right? A shortage. At the going price, people want more of the product than is available. Well, what's the natural thing to happen here? Well, that shortage creates upward pressure on prices, right? Firms are to some degree on the short side of the market, and their price can go up a little bit, but that once again pushes us back to this equilibrium point where nobody has any incentive to do anything else, right? And by the way, quantity demanded and quantity supplied are exactly equal to one another. We would say maybe the market clears if you want to add a technical term there. So equilibrium, it's this point of stability, right, that the market should tend to over time. Okay, well, as is the custom in this class, I got ahead of my slides again. And here's kind of what I just said on the overhead projector, but much aesthetically pleasing here on a slide. And indeed, I picked the wrong quantity and price. Here my equilibrium price is $1, and here my equilibrium quantity is 10 million bottles per day. Yes?
But we still have this distribution of prices for a very similar product.
Oh.
Right?
Yes.
It's not always like there are bottled waters for $1, for $2, for $3. In the market, we still have this distribution.
Ooh. Wow, that's a great question. So, right, this is true of almost everything. And so the comment was that, well, in the real world, right, what we really have are a whole distribution of different prices of bottled water, right? Different demands and different supplies for all of them, presumably. What's going on here? Well, here we have the simplest possible case where bottled water is there's one type of it, right? And that's the only good on the market, right? But we have these various complexities of the real world that we're going to ultimately have to think about, right? I kind of slid it past you here, right, as I built together my very stylized specific case, right? And so if you think back a couple classes where I talked about kind of the steps in our logic, build a simple case, right? Then bring it to some applications, and then think about things like this. Well, departures. What if there are multiple types of bottled water? This and that and the other thing. I slid it past you without cleanly defining what I was thinking. But maybe now I can say, once we understand the simplest case, how this particular market works, the single market, maybe then we can build out some of those other cases. And indeed, we're heading towards that. Great question. Okay. By the way, I say the law of market forces in this slide. I don't know if there is such a thing. You might say by the combined forces of the law of supply and the law of demand. Right? We wind up at this equilibrium point. So once again, I was out in front of my slides. Here's a graphical illustration of a surplus putting downward pressure on a price towards equilibrium. Right? We can also do the same with shortages. It is, even though, and I should say this, pursuant to that comment about the real markets being more complex with variety of product and all that, you can still, as we will see, look at certain markets and kind of think about how some of this applies. So, and this will also foreshadow some other things here. So years ago, I stumbled across this article here, and it was about the shortage of snowplow drivers in Maine, right? And it's kind of a nice way to think about it here. So in Maine, they have a wage that a snowplow driver is paid, and what this article is about is how everybody is trying to hire snowplow drivers for the state at this going wage, but there just aren't enough people to fill the job. And you might think about this as a situation. One reason why I point this out is because a labor market you can think of, as a variation on our, let's see here, on the theme here, where our demand, right, comes from businesses, or in this case, the towns of Maine, trying to hire workers, right? And the supply comes from, I guess, people who are, could be drivers, right? Snowplow drivers. And what happens is that the going wage here is such that the towns want a lot more workers, right, than are willing to work at this wage. So there's a shortage. Interesting, okay. So that's just another example of demand and supply. I have an example of a surplus, which might be our first encounter with I guess you might call the law of unintended consequences. We'll get into this later. And that oftentimes, things that, when a market doesn't function correctly, right, oftentimes things that were completely unexpected happen as a result. So here we have an article where there's a surplus of milk out there, right? There's a surplus of milk. So what happens here is the price of milk is greater than it is than the equilibrium price, right? And so this would be my red line here. The supply of milk, of course, comes from dairy farmers, and the demand comes from consumers. The world is such that the price is too high, so there's a surplus of milk, right? Well, nobody buys this surplus, and obviously milk spoils if you don't use it, so one thing you can do is you can store it, right? And it turns out you can store milk by making cheese. Right? That's one effective way to at least put off the spoilage. And so here you can see here, while we consume a lot of cheese, because of this glut in the dairy product market, I guess, you could say it turns out there's this surplus of cheese. Not everybody is buying the cheese that's out there. So one question that might be forming in your mind is, well, and any economist might ask this question is, why is there a surplus and why isn't the price adjusting towards equilibrium in these cases? It's a provocative question that we'll get to in the not too distant future. Okay, I'm dying to just kind of get into this and use our supply and demand to understand some things. And maybe one of the first things you can do is you can use supply and demand. By the way, we've done a very careful job of keeping those two things separate as we brought them together. And so we're going to want to continue to think about the world that way, right? Things change in the world. Well, when they change, what changes, demand or supply? And then what is the outcome of all of this? I call it here comparative statics. That's again kind of a physicsy, sciencey term, right? It's a term that suggests that, that you're sort of looking at one equilibrium and changing something and then seeing what the new equilibrium looks like. Still recording. Okay. So you may have noticed I've been experimenting with you may not have, but I've been experimenting with different recording qualities and all of that stuff. So you never know if it's working or not. But okay. Anyway, so comparative statics. What we're going to do is we're going to say, let's think about a market in equilibrium. Let's change something. What is the new equilibrium like, and what is it? How does it compare to the old equilibrium? Right. That's a comparative statics exercise. And you'll see that you can actually understand a great deal about markets by thinking about this. So one example here might be this very first one, the market for bottled water and a news report that tap water is unsafe. So we might start, the way I'm thinking about this now is I'm saying, okay, we're going to start off with a bottled water market in equilibrium, right? Then we're going to imagine that this news report comes down the pike that says tap water is unsafe. What does this change about our bottled water market? And then what would the ultimate result be? Okay, so that's the experiment, right? So we start off like this. A market happily in equilibrium. Here's demand. Here's supply. Here's quantity per day, I guess. Price per unit. Right? We're in equilibrium here. Now this news report comes along which says that tap water is unsafe. Right? By the way, bottled water comes from Maine or something, so it's not tap water here. So it's not water in general. It's just the tap water that's unsafe. The bottled water hasn't changed. So what should this do to this picture? Well, yes. Okay, it'll shift the demand curve, right? You can think about it this way. Well, tap water is a substitute product, right? Intuitively, is a substitute product for bottled water. If it's less safe, well, then what should happen? Well, that should kind of change tastes towards buying more bottled water, right? And that should constitute a shift out in demand, like this. So I might call this D prime, and then I can kind of do the whole thing here. So you can see here our immediate prediction is that, well, this change should start at equilibrium here and then push us up to equilibrium there, right? You might even want to reason your way through the steps here. The first thing that happens, right, if you think about prices kind of starting off here, is this news report comes out and surprises everybody, right? So demand, obviously, the minute you read the news report, you can say, "Oh no, I'm buying. I want more bottled water." So the demand shifts out, and the price stays kind of at what everybody thought it would be. Well, you can see here when demand shifts, right, and the price is constant, this creates a shortage, right? Well, this shortage then generates the pressure on the market to push it towards this new equilibrium. So the demand shock, if you want to think about it that way, we often talk about shocks to demand. The demand shock comes along, creates a shortage, and then that pulls the new equilibrium in this direction. So you can see the end result is that quantity has gone up. I'll call it P prime and Q prime. Quantity has gone up and the market price has gone up, right? So there's a very simple prediction. And here I actually attach a fancy term to this prediction. I say a positive model of how the world works. So what do I mean by that? I'll throw it out there just to put the idea in your mind, but we'll get into this a little bit later in class about positive modeling versus normative modeling. So these positive models just make little predictions about how the variables in our system behave. So our prediction is, well, if there's a shock to the demand, if people suddenly want more bottled water, well, that should raise the price and the quantity exchanged in the market, right? Now, a normative prediction, normative is a judgment about values, right? What does that mean here? Well, it means, well, is this good or bad? First, the price has gone up, the quantity's gone up. Well, suppliers are happy about this higher price. Consumers aren't, but they're buying more water. So what does it all mean in terms of that, right? Societal well-being or welfare. That question is harder, but we're going to say something about it today, and I think you'll begin to see how this method works. We'll get to that a little bit later. So here's my example. Once again, drawn out nicely on the slide, so you don't have to look at my handwriting on the overhead projector. Okay, well, now that we sort of understand how this works, we can think about, the real world is complicated and there's changes to all sorts of things out there. And you can start to think about how markets respond to all sorts of things here. So let's see, we have avocados and an increase in land rents, chicken when the price of beef drops. I'm going to do those first two, chicken, beef, avocados, land, and then we'll just kind of talk our way through bullet point 4, and maybe I'll leave 3 for you to think about this labor market for fast food workers. Okay, so the first scenario I had in mind was, here's our quantity and price, demand, supply. There's avocados, and we say, well, land for, maybe it's trying to think of a scenario. There's always land is scarce, of course, so maybe population growth is pushing up the demand for housing and that sort of thing. And as a result, rents in general start going up in in a particular area of the country that also grows avocados. Maybe even like, California or something like that. Well, what does this do to our market? And then ultimately what will happen to the price and quantity of avocados as a result? Well, let's see. Land rents. They've gotten more expensive. Obviously, when you make avocados, right, you grow them. That's kind of farming and all that stuff. But you also hire workers, and you have to pay rent on land that you're using, right? So those are what we called in a previous slide inputs in production. When they become more expensive, it makes it harder for firms, or less profitable for firms, to supply avocados at any given price, right? I know we kind of jumped right past shifting supply around, but you might say that this results in firms supplying less at any given price. So what would that look like? Well, that would be kind of a shift back in supply, right? If that's a little mysterious to you, just look down here, and you can see, well, if the price is here at the old land rents, the firm would supply this amount, but at the new land rents, the firm is supplying a lot less. It's saying, well, it's just not worth it for us. It's not profitable for us to supply avocados. So suffice it to say that this land rent change shifts the supply of avocados back, and we arrive at, we started with the quantity here. You can see quantity falls, and you can also see that price goes up. So we expect that there would be fewer avocados sold in the market, and that those that were sold would be sold at a higher price. Now, once again, you can think about this as being driven by, sort of the supply shift occurs. Everybody goes to the market, and they see that there aren't many avocados there, right? Then they want a lot of them if they're, say, $1 an avocado, but there aren't enough, right? There's this shortage of avocados, and of course the shortage at the old price creates this push towards the new equilibrium. So in the end, we compare these two things, right? Okay. So there's an example of a supply shift. So chicken and beef, right? Let's see here. Here we have the demand, supply, quantity, price. What did I say? The price of beef drops or goes up? Drops. Okay, well, the price of beef drops. Well, that's more about the demand, the price of a related product, right? And that's something that filters in through demand, right? So we'd say, okay, we're talking about a demand change here. When beef gets cheaper, if we think of that as a substitute for chicken, people should be buying less chicken. That should mean that we shift back, right? We shift back supply here, and you can see that one way of thinking about this, is that at the old price, once demand shifts back, we now have a surplus of chicken in the market, right? So what this does is creates natural pressure for the price of chicken to come down to the equilibrium here. So relative to where we started, we see quantity falls and price falls when the demand shifts back here. Maybe I will just dive in with this fast food worker example here, because here's quantity and price. Demand now comes from fast food businesses, right? They're trying to sell fast food, and supply is just from the local population, people who want to work, right? So you'd say, okay, well, in this case, the price of work is a wage, right? The wage rate that you earn. So at higher wages, people want to work more. I slipped that, you might say, well, wait a minute, do I really want to work more when my wage goes up? Complicated question, we'll suppose yes. If you want to get into, whether or not people work more or less when their incomes go up, that's a big principles of micro question. But usually at lower wages, this is how it works. Demand comes from fast food establishments, right? Now, as my story went, when a new resort opened up? a new resort opens. Okay, so you might think about this meaning a lot more foot traffic, a lot more people and all that, more fast food establishments. This should amount to here we have our initial equilibrium, demand shifting out like this, right? Where the demand comes from firms trying to hire workers. Once again, you can see here we have the shortage, right? And this should cause the wage to come up and for employment in this case to go up. So once again, this is kind of my way of getting you used to the idea that you can take this model and move it around and look at all sorts of different situations, even if we haven't put in all the, built in some important things in the real world, right? And in fact, that's kind of a neat thing we can do here. I have some other examples that are kind of interesting, and this is maybe my reminder about how in the real world, you don't actually see those curves, but you sort of picture them operating behind the scenes. This is also a way of sort of congratulating you on getting this straight in your minds, because it's not so simple to think about something that you see in the real world and imagine all the machinery working behind it. So one thing that's kind of interesting here is that we have the price of a taxi medallion in New York City over time. This is kind of some interesting data here, where we have the number of medallions, we have the price of a medallion over time. So here, it's a good situation because we only observe the price, right, of this in this data. We don't observe how many medallions are taking hands or changing hands or anything like that. But you could, if you looked at this data, you can say, well, what the heck happened? 2013, well, that was roughly the time Uber started to appear in New York City. And so if you want to think about where the demand for medallions comes from, well, you could sort of think about the demand for medallions coming from drivers, right? Before Uber was around, you kind of needed a medallion to operate a taxi, right? So there was some supply out there of medallions and some demand of medallions. Once Uber came along, you had this big alternative, right? You had this alternative that you could pursue if you were a driver. And that would be to say, well, I'm just going to, I have my car here. I'm going to go get a license with Uber. I'll get a TL&C license instead of buying this medallion. As a result, you would expect that the demand for medallions would shift back, because in some ways the price of a substitute has it's gotten a lot cheaper, right? It's gotten a lot easier for me to pay some money and get into the livery car game. And so you can see here, this should result in a fall in the price just like this, right? So in this case, we have a fall in the price of medallions, right? That was weird. I thought we lost it. There's like 6 overhead projectors in the back, so I'm not that worried. A fall in the price of medallions. Now, there are some interesting things that you might say about this. We'll get a little bit later. So the supply of medallions is fixed. Might be one thing that you brought into this. We don't have any information on that on the slide, but that wouldn't really change anything. A fixed supply, by the way, might just be a completely vertical curve like this. And there, the conclusion still follows that when the demand drops because of this alternative, the price should fall as well. And I was really sloppy here labeling my axes. You should always do that if you can. So, and even though you'll notice that what I did there was I kind of looked at this graph and I said, well, the big thing that happened is the price was high and then it's a lot lower. And even though it's kind of bouncing around and all of that stuff, there's all these other things happening. I can capture the big trend using my very simple model, right? This fall in the demand for these things. So it's also interesting to think about other things that have happened at the same time. Like I was here in the city well before that, 2006, 2007. I live in the Bronx. I always had this problem getting a cab bring me home, right? you'd say, well, you'd hail a cab, and they'd say, where are you going, before they let you into the car, and you'd say, well, I'm going to the Bronx, and they'd say, I'm sorry, I'm changing shifts, right? I don't think that happens nearly as often as it used to now, right? Because I don't think cabs can kind of pick and choose their rides the way they could before Uber came along. So there's another thing, but we're just explaining this basic effect. Question? Yes, two questions. Go.
The prices started decreasing again after.
Why did they go down and then up again?
Why? Well, I understand why they go up. I understand why they go down.
Yeah, that was the.
All right, sorry.
Yeah, no. But you're right to notice.
More and more drivers from 2011 to 2013, and then Uber came.
Yeah. So, and you can think about it this way: the supply of I had the vertical supply here. The supply of medallions is more or less fixed until the city wants to periodically, expand the taxi fleet. Then it sells more medallions. But in this case, people said we'll just stop buying medallions. We'll do this Uber thing instead. So, another question?
So, demand decreases because taxi is not as much valuable anymore. And why doesn't supply change?
Oh, well, in this case, you're already asking second-order questions. I like that. Why doesn't supply change here? Well, in this case, the supply curve is actually, there's a fixed amount of medallions, and if you want to operate a taxi, you need a medallion, right? That's determined by law, right? So periodically, the city expands the medallions and sells them off, and the market, they exchange in a market and all that stuff. Of course, they also do things like they have green taxis, which is a different sort of medallion, right? The outer borough taxis. Yes.
Do you think the price of the medallion would increase since the rideshare market is so oversaturated with new drivers now? So do you think maybe the taxi medallion prices actually rise since there's an influx of too many Uber drivers?
Maybe, yeah. I mean, there's a lot of. You might sort of think about it that way, right? Once the market's saturated with Uber drivers, there's still things you can't do if you're an Uber driver. One of which is, you can't just grab someone who raises their hand up. You're not supposed to anyway, and take cash for a ride, right? So yeah, certainly. And it's. I mean, one thing that's great about this is once you get a little bit of economics and you see a graph of some real world data, hopefully it gets you thinking, right? It really gets you kind of interested in these things. So I have to move along here. One thing I was looking at this. I like to look at oil prices. I don't, and this is an interesting example. I'm going to try to fast forward here. So if you look at oil prices, and this is something that an economist might do, and I'll do this quickly here. You can kind of see that there was this before period, right? One way of looking at this data is it was kind of flat up until about 2014, and then it dropped from like 120 to 60. Seesaws around it, but once again there was seemingly this big drop in the price of oil around that time. And of course, right around this time is where fracking technology really began to come online, right? And it made oil production in the United States in particular possible in a way that, and at a cost that it wasn't before, right? So this is a big technological change. And you might say, well, okay, how do we explain this drop in the price? Once again, we just have the price here. Your information is often incomplete. You don't know the whole supply and demand curve. How would we explain this drop in price? Well, we know that fracking came along around that time. How would that work in terms of our supply and demand diagram? Well, let's see. Here we have demand and supply. We have quantity, price. We have the price of oil. I got to do this quickly. The quantity exchanged. Well, fracking represents a change in technology, right? Now, firms out there can supply more oil at the same price that they could before. At any given price, they can supply more of it because of this technological change. That should shift the supply out and cause the price to fall to a new lower price, right? There's some really interesting things about oil prices we'll talk about later too. But you can think about that as maybe explaining why the price seemed to just, even though it's still bouncing around, there's all these little changes in supply and demand all the time, but that was a big one, and that might be the reason why it came down like that. And maybe that's a good one. We can say, well, that's how we might explain that. Is that a good or a bad thing? Well, oil, complex. Do we like having low oil prices, or do we like having high oil prices? Environment, and there's all these interesting things behind the scenes there. Okay. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to take 10 minutes, I hope, and just talk about this case here, which gives you a preview of what we're going to do in classes to come. And this is to attach some sort of normative significance to our market outcomes. What do I mean by normative? Well, I hinted earlier that this has to do with making some value judgment about whether or not the observed outcome is a good one or a bad one. And the way we do this is we look at our market and we attach some additional information to it, right? In a way that lets us make some value judgment. So my market here is going to be the market for illicit drugs, right? Even though, and I guess they're not as illegal as they used to be, but many sorts of drugs are illegal. That doesn't mean there isn't a market for them. And we're going to think about how this market works and what certain policies might do, right? So before we do any of that, we're going to think about how we can describe, how we can rate the equilibrium outcomes in this market. What is a good outcome? What is a bad outcome? Well, what do I even mean by that? First things first, let's notice that we can attach some meaning to the geometry of this graph that might not have been immediately obvious before. So when we get an equilibrium quantity, right, and we have an equilibrium price, well, we have a line segment here, right, 0 to Q, and a line segment here, 0 to P. If we want to think about what P times Q is, well, then that just becomes this whole rectangle, right, formed by the origin, the lower left corner, the upper right corner is our equilibrium. So P times Q gives us this rectangle. Now, why do I point this out? This gives us a way of seeing how much money people are spending on drugs or on anything in general, right? P times Q, take the price, the number of units, P times Q is the total expenditures. So this geometric object here, this rectangle, you can call the total expenditure rectangle, right? Maybe that wasn't obvious before, but hopefully it is now. It's right there on our graph for us. Okay, so that's one thing. But now what we can do is we can attach some sort of significance to this, and we can use this rectangle maybe to rate our market outcomes. So maybe the way we think about illicit drugs is we say, okay, well, in general, if people are spending more money on them, that's a worse outcome for society, right? You might say that this rectangle, put another way, this total expenditures rectangle, well, when it gets bigger in area, that means that society is by and large in a worse position. Why would you say that? Well, you might say, well, if people are spending more of their money in aggregate on drugs, that's not great. You might say that if you're thinking about drugs that are illegal, the amount of money, right, in the market is kind of proportional to the amount of crime that is occurring there. So we can think about these rectangles as sort of describing market outcomes in a way that analogizes with something we can make a judgment about. So one very obvious example about how this all might work, let's see here. So demand and supply. Across here, we can imagine that maybe something happens that increases the demand for illicit drugs. Well, that shifts out demand and supply, and we can say, all right, well, we know what will happen. The price will go up in the market, and the quantity will go up in the market. Well, that's our positive prediction, like we've been making, just how the world will work, that we've been making all along. But now if we add in this expenditure criterion, we can say, well, let's see. Before, people were spending this amount on illicit drugs before this change in demand. After the change in demand, they're now spending this amount that I've hatched in black here. That's unambiguously more, right? So now what we would say is this bigger rectangle is worse from the perspective of society. That is to say, if we could pick between this point and this point as our market equilibrium, we would prefer this one because there's less money in general being spent for the reasons that I described before. Okay, moving on. We're all okay on that. Now we have this criterion by which we're rating our equilibria. How big is the rectangle? Well, there's kind of my assumption that violence, those sorts of things are proportional to this rectangle. What happens when demand increases, supply decreases, demand decreases? We can think about all of these things, and you can sort of parse them all out on this diagram. I have a demand increase, that was bad. Well, if you flipped this around, you can kind of see that anything that decreases demand is good, right? Anything that decreases demand is good. So it'll always, you can't, if you shift this demand curve back and back and back, the rectangle always gets smaller, right? What about supply changes? Let's try this out here. Demand, what am I doing? Quantity, price, demand, supply, right? If we, one thing that we might do is we might consider a policy of, let's suppose we crack down on drug dealing and things like that, right? Put more police out there and more enforcement agents, so on and so forth. What would that do to change this market for illicit drugs? What would you think? Yes? It's going to lower the supply, right? Good. Shift back the supply. Well, let's see what happens here. If we shift back the supply, we can see here that our positive model predicts that the quantity will go down and the price will go up, right? One thing goes down, the other goes up. Yes? Okay, we don't want, well, the quantity demanded has fallen, right? The demand we're supposing doesn't change here. And I guess you could think of scenarios where the amount of drugs people want to buy when there's a crackdown changes, but we're going to suppose that this is I should have been more clear about this, a crackdown on drug dealing suppliers, right? We'll say. That's a good clarification.
It's like you took the demand from the other graph and now you're looking at the supply.
We're just shifting the supply, yes. Everything else is the same. Good clarification. So you can see here the rectangle has changed from this to this. So now we're in a bit of a quandary, right? I kind of said it before. The quantity goes down, but the price goes up. So the product of those two things, it's not obvious how the product changes, right? Put another way, we don't know whether these changes are making the problem worse or better, right? We don't know if blue rectangle is bigger than red rectangle, right? So, I mean, you might even think about a policy. Let's suppose we have a legalization policy. Well, what does that do to the supply, right? We'll say legalization, selling drugs legal, right? I'll try to be clear about it so that I don't confound it with what I was saying before. Well, that you would expect shifts out the supply, right? Something like that. And so now we can add to it this black rectangle here. But that doesn't really change anything. Now the quantity is going up and the price is going down, but the expenditure rectangle, once again, it's not obvious how it changes, right? So if we wanted to think about all of this from a policy perspective, right, you might say, well, okay, anything we can do to reduce demand for illicit drugs will always give us smaller rectangles. That's good. So what sorts of things might reduce demand? I don't know, education, right? Say no to drugs. That was the big policy when I was in high school and all that. Great. So we know that that's good. But now we're not sure what to do based on this evidence here, right? Well, what do? Do we crack down on drugs, dealing drugs, and go for a blue rectangle? Or do we make drugs legal and go for the black rectangle? We don't know based on this, right? So there's one way you might answer this is you might say, well, this is a question for the data, right? We could go out and we could look at some data on sales and all this stuff and try to figure it out. And indeed, that's kind of what you learn how to do in an econometrics class. But maybe I can be a little bit more suggestive for you and say, we can hypothetically imagine now, think about the slopes of these various curves, and I'll think about, here's supply, and we'll think about a demand curve that's very flat, like this, right? Very flat. Now in this situation, a flat demand curve, by the way, if you sort of think about it, what it means is that demand is very responsive to price. Right? The lingo that we won't use it much in this class, but when you take Eco 200, you'll talk about the elasticity of the curve. You would say it's very elastic here, meaning that small price changes mean big quantity changes. So a flat demand curve kind of looks like this, right? Change price a little bit, and you get big changes in Q. So notice that when we have a flat demand curve here, if we were to shift back supply, right? Now the answer about what happens to the rectangle is a bit more obvious, right? You can see that in this situation, when the demand curve is very flat, decreasing the supply seems like a pretty good idea, right? At least in terms of trying to make rectangles smaller. Now a rectangle was big, and now it's gotten a lot smaller. The reason is quite simple. Quantity responds a lot, right, to this change in supply. Price doesn't change much, so we wind up really reducing expenditures, right? Of course, if we expanded or if we pursued the legalization option, I guess, if you want to think about this as the crackdown and this is the legalization, you can see what happens here is supply shifts out and the rectangle gets a lot bigger. So when you go and fiddle around with your data and figure out what the slope of these curves are like, if you find that this demand curve is flat, right, by asking questions as we've done before, well, then that would seem to suggest that a crackdown would be the better policy. Uh-oh. But what if you find out something else? What if your demand curve was really steep, right? So in this case, right, we have our supply like this, and there's demand. Here you have this situation that's the opposite. You change the price a huge amount, and quantity barely changes, right? Quantity barely changes at all. So now you can see that what would happen if we cracked down is we wind up making the rectangle enormous. That's bad, right? Essentially what we're doing is, and you've probably heard this story before, is by making things illegal, you're just making drugs really expensive, right? And all of that addition, by making them expensive, you're just increasing the expenditures drastically. Yeah?
Does it imply that drugs are necessary? Because this diagram looks like about products that are like first needs of people.
Let's get into that after I make one more point. So now you're asking exactly the right question. If we shift out supply in this case, right, maybe that's our legalization policy, you see what happens? The rectangle gets a lot smaller, right? So now we've encountered something interesting. The responsiveness of the demand for drugs is what's going to drive our policy response, and these policies work in exactly opposite ways. Yes?
Drugs are meant to be addictive, so they're all be addictive for.
Aha! So now we want to ask ourselves, which of these pictures applies to drugs, or illicit drugs? And it might depend on the drug that you have in mind. Are they elastic? Right? Do people's demand change drastically with the price? Or are they inelastic? Is it more or less fixed? In both cases, the policy recommendation is opposite. So 30-second punchline here. One thing that you might do, or one thing that you might ask, is you might say, well, for some people, demand is elastic, and for others it's inelastic, right? So for example, if you're addicted to drugs, your demand is inelastic. If you're not, right, you're an experimenter, maybe it's elastic. So what you might want to do as a policymaker is separate those two populations, right? For those who have an elastic demand, get the supply down. For those who have an inelastic demand, legalize. And indeed, this is kind of the logic behind some of these programs where you say we're going to make it hard to buy drugs in the market, but what we'll do is we'll provide drugs by prescription to people who are addicted, right? So you're trying to reduce the supply for one group and increase it for the other. That was a very quick punchline, but hopefully that's kind of a provocative illustration. So have a good weekend.